The grand cathedral bells of Yharnam echo through fog-shrouded streets, their bronze voices carrying a promise that once drew pilgrims from every corner of the world. Stand here, in the shadow of these towering Gothic spires, and you can almost feel the desperation that brought them, the sick, the dying, the hopeless, all seeking the miraculous blood healing that made this city legendary. They came believing they would find salvation in these hallowed halls, never knowing they were walking into the mouth of damnation itself. Welcome, seekers of forbidden knowledge, to Keen 7 Lore, where we delve into the darkest corners of gaming's most intricate narratives. Today, we're peeling back the layers of one of Bloodborne's most tragic stories, the complete and utter corruption of the Healing Church. What began as humanity's greatest medical breakthrough became its most horrifying curse, and the path from salvation to damnation unfolded in 3 distinct phases, each more disturbing than the last. Picture, if you will, a time before the beast Scourge, before the hunters prowled these streets with their savage weapons. Yharnam was already an ancient city, built upon even older foundations, its underground labyrinths hiding secrets that should have remained buried. The Healing Church's story doesn't begin with evil intentions or malicious plots. It begins with discovery, with wonder, and with the kind of ambition that believes itself righteous, even as it paves the road to hell. The blood ministration that would define Yharnam's fate wasn't discovered by the church. It was found by scholars of Byrgenwerth, that secluded institute of learning, nestled deep in the forbidden woods. These academics, led by Master Willem, uncovered something extraordinary in the tombs beneath their feet. The old blood, a substance with properties that defied all natural law. When administered to the sick, it could cure any ailment, heal any wound, restore vitality to the dying. It was nothing short of miraculous. But miracles, as we'll discover, always come with a price. The Healing Church would rise from a fundamental disagreement about that price, about what humanity should do with such power. It would grow into an institution that dominated every aspect of Yharnam life, its influence spreading like blood through veins until the city itself became inseparable from the church's dark practices. And ultimately, it would fall into experiments so blasphemous, so removed from its original healing mission, that the very concept of salvation became twisted into something unrecognizable. If you're finding yourself drawn into this tale of corruption and cosmic horror, I'd genuinely appreciate if you'd hit that like button. It truly helps this exploration reach other lore enthusiasts who share our fascination with these dark narratives. Your support means everything and helps keep these deep investigations coming. Let's begin with the first phase of corruption, the Schism that birthed the Healing Church itself. The story starts at Byrgenwerth, where Master Willem presided over his scholars with the wisdom of age and the caution of one who understood that some doors, once opened, can never be closed. The discovery of the old blood in the ancient Thumerian labyrinths should have been humanity's greatest triumph. Here was proof of civilizations that came before, of beings that transcended human limitation. The blood itself seemed to pulse with otherworldly power, and when the scholars experimented with it, carefully, methodically, the results were undeniable. Wounds closed before their eyes. Diseases that had plagued humanity for millennia simply vanished. The lame walked, the blind saw, the dying returned from death's very threshold. Among Willem's students, one burned brightest with ambition, Laurence. Where Willem saw danger in the blood's power, Laurence saw destiny. Their philosophical divide ran deeper than simple disagreement. It was a fundamental split in how they viewed humanity's future. Willem believed that humanity needed to evolve through understanding, through insight into the cosmos and our place within it. "Our eyes are yet to open," he would say, convinced that true ascension came from knowledge, not from physical transformation. He feared the blood, understanding on some instinctual level that its gifts were poison wrapped in salvation. Laurence couldn't accept this cautious approach. He looked at the blood and saw immediate salvation for countless suffering souls. Why should humanity struggle toward some distant enlightenment when the power to end all suffering lay within their grasp? The arguments between master and student grew heated, then bitter. Willem's famous adage, "Fear the old blood," became his desperate warning to Laurence, but his most brilliant pupil had already made up his mind. The exact moment of their final break remains shrouded in mystery, but we know how it ended. Laurence left Byrgenwerth, taking with him other scholars who shared his vision, and most crucially, he took the old blood. Some accounts suggest he literally stole it in the night. Others claim Willem let him go, knowing he couldn't stop what was coming, but hoping his warnings might echo in Laurence's mind. Whatever the truth, Laurence's departure marked the end of one era and the beginning of another, far darker, chapter in human history. The Healing Church didn't emerge overnight. Laurence was methodical in his approach, understanding that to truly change the world, he needed more than just the blood. He needed infrastructure, influence, and most importantly, he needed the desperate faith of the masses. He began small, offering blood ministration to select individuals, choosing cases that would generate the most dramatic testimonials. A child dying of consumption, suddenly restored to perfect health. A woman whose bones had been shattered in an accident, walking within days. A man whose flesh had been ravaged by disease, his skin becoming smooth and whole after a single treatment. Word spread like wildfire. The miracle blood of Yharnam became legend, and with each cure, Laurence's following grew. But he was clever enough to understand that power without structure was chaos. He wrapped his blood ministry in religious ceremony, creating rituals and rites that transformed medical treatment into sacred communion. The Healing Church was born not just as a medical institution, but as a faith centered on the transformative power of the old blood. This is where we begin to see the subtle genius of Laurence's corruption. By making the blood sacred, he elevated it beyond question. To doubt the blood was to doubt the church, and to doubt the church was heresy. The early church's scripture speaks of blood as the bridge between humanity and divinity, the medium through which mankind would ascend to its rightful place among the cosmos. These weren't just medical treatments anymore, they were religious experiences, and Laurence positioned himself as the prophet of humanity's evolution. If you're finding value in uncovering these dark origins and want to explore more gaming lore at this depth, consider subscribing to join our growing community of lore seekers. Your support truly makes these detailed investigations possible, and there's so much more darkness to explore together. The second phase of the church's corruption came with its meteoric rise to power, when blood became not just a medicine, but the very currency of control in Yharnam. As the Healing Church grew from a radical medical ministry into Yharnam's dominant institution, the nature of its corruption evolved. No longer content with simply healing the sick, the church began to see itself as the architect of humanity's future. The blood ministration that had started as miraculous healing became something far more complex and far more sinister. The transformation happened gradually, almost imperceptibly. At first, the church simply expanded its operations to meet demand. Grand cathedrals rose throughout Yharnam, each one a monument to the blood's power and a center for ministration. The architectural style itself, those towering spires, the grotesque gargoyles, The overwhelming sense of reaching towards something beyond human comprehension reflected the Church's growing obsession with transcendence. But with expansion came bureaucracy, and with bureaucracy came hierarchy. The Church began to stratify, creating different levels of blood ministration. Common blood for common ailments, administered to the masses who flocked to Yharnam seeking cures. Special blood, more potent and carefully controlled, reserved for those who could afford the Church's favour. And then, whispered about, but never openly discussed, the experiments with blood that went beyond healing into the realm of transformation. The establishment of the Church Hunters under Ludwig the Accursed, though he wasn't known by that title yet, marked a crucial turning point. The official story was simple. As Yharnam grew prosperous from its blood trade, it needed protection from the beasts that roamed the wilderness beyond its walls. Ludwig, with his radiant sword and unwavering faith, seemed the perfect holy warrior to lead this protective force. The Healing Church workshop, established to craft specialized weapons for these hunters, produced instruments of incredible beauty and devastating purpose. But the true reason for the hunters' creation was far darker. The Church knew, had always known, that the blood carried a terrible side effect. The more blood a person received, the closer they walked to a precipice from which there was no return. The beast Scourge wasn't an external threat that occasionally breached Yharnam's walls. It was growing from within, fed by the very ministrations the Church performed. Consider the cruel irony. The Church created hunters to kill the beasts that the Church itself was creating through its blood ministration. They were essentially cleaning up their own mess while maintaining the illusion that the beast Scourge was an external threat, something that brave hunters protected innocent citizens from. Ludwig himself believed in his holy mission with such fervour that he never questioned why the number of beasts seemed to grow in proportion to the Church's expansion. The ashen blood epidemic in Old Yharnam represents perhaps the most damning evidence of the Church's willing descent into darkness. Historical records, pieced together from scattered notes and fading testimonials, paint a picture of sudden plague that swept through the district's crowded streets. People spoke of poisoned water, of a sickness that turned their blood to ash in their veins. The symptoms were horrifying: fever, delirium, a gradual greying of the skin as if the very life was being drained from within. The Healing Church arrived like salvation itself. They set up ministration centres throughout Old Yharnam, offering free blood treatment to any who suffered from the ashen blood. The people, desperate and dying, accepted without question. Within weeks, the epidemic was contained. The Church was hailed as heroes, their reputation soaring even higher. But evidence suggests, and this comes from multiple sources found scattered throughout the game, that the Church didn't just cure the ashen blood epidemic, they caused it. The poisoning of Old Yharnam's water supply appears to have been deliberate, a manufactured crisis that would demonstrate the Church's power while providing them with an entire district's worth of test subjects. The blood ministration given to cure the ashen blood was different, more experimental, and the results would only become apparent later. The Church's internal structure during this period reveals the systematic nature of their corruption. At the top sat the choir, an elite group that occupied the upper cathedral ward and claimed to be the ones closest to the cosmos. They dressed in the garb of the old Byrgenwerth scholars, but perverted Willem's pursuit of insight into something far more invasive. The choir didn't just seek to understand the cosmos, they sought to commune with it, to draw down entities from beyond the stars and learn their secrets. Below them, the school of Mensis operated from the shadows of Yahar Ghul, the unseen village. While the choir reached upward, Mensis delved deeper into forbidden research, their methods growing increasingly extreme. They began with volunteers, those desperate enough to offer themselves for experimentation in exchange for special blood treatments. When volunteers became scarce, they found other means of procurement. The regular clergy, those who performed daily ministrations and maintained the church's public face, may not have known the full extent of what occurred in the upper echelons. They continued their work, genuinely believing they were servants of humanity's salvation. This compartmentalization of knowledge, keeping the true horror confined to those already too deep to turn back, allowed the church to maintain its benevolent facade, even as its core rotted from within. The research hall, established during this period of expansion, exemplified the church's complete abandonment of medical ethics in favor of cosmic ambition. Positioned between the regular church operations and the choir's lofty experiments, it became a factory of horror disguised as a medical facility. The patients brought there were told they would receive special treatment, that they were chosen for an honor beyond imagination. They had no idea they were walking into a nightmare from which most would never wake. The church's influence over Yharnam became absolute during this phase. They controlled the blood, and through the blood, they controlled everything. The city's economy revolved around the pilgrimages of those seeking healing. The social hierarchy was determined by one's access to blood ministration. Even the government became secondary to church authority. After all, what power could compete with those who held the key to life and death? The establishment of the orphanage, operated by the choir, represents another layer of calculated cruelty. On the surface, it was a charitable institution, taking in children who had lost their parents to the beast scourge or disease. The church provided these orphans with food, shelter, education, everything a growing child needed. But the true purpose was far more sinister. The choir believed that young minds were more adaptable, more capable of withstanding the cosmic truths they sought to unveil. These children became test subjects for experiments in forcing human consciousness to comprehend realities beyond our dimensional understanding. Many of these orphans would eventually become members of the choir themselves, their minds having been shaped from childhood to accept the incomprehensible. They would stand in their celestial garb, looking down at new orphans arriving at their door, and feel nothing but cold scientific interest. The cycle of corruption perpetuated itself, each generation deeper in the darkness than the last. The blood saints, young women chosen for their unique compatibility with the old blood, represented another evolution in the church's practices. These women were venerated, treated as living holy relics, but their reality was one of constant extraction and refinement. Their blood, once processed through their bodies, took on special properties that the church found particularly valuable. They lived lives of luxury and imprisonment, golden cages where they produced the church's most precious commodity. It was during this phase that the church's various factions began to compete with each other, each believing their approach to transcendence was superior. The choir sought communion with the great ones through ritual and reaching toward the cosmos. The school of Mensis pursued more direct methods, attempting to physically breach the barriers between dimensions. The hunters, led by Ludwig and later German, tried to maintain order while growing increasingly disturbed by what they were asked to do. This internal competition drove each faction to greater extremes. If the choir made a breakthrough in their celestial communion, Mensis would respond with even more radical experiments. If Mensis gained favor through their results, the choir would push their orphan subjects harder, seeking more dramatic revelations. The regular church ministry, caught between these extremes, began to fracture. Some clerics maintained their faith in Laurence's original vision, while others aligned themselves with whatever faction promised the most power or knowledge. The third phase of corruption, the era of experimentation, would transform the Healing Church from an institution that had lost its way into one that actively embraced damnation. The research hall stands as a monument to how far the Healing Church had fallen from its original purpose. Lady Maria of the Astral Clock Tower, one of the first hunters and a distant relative of the Canehurst nobility, oversaw the experiments conducted within those sterile halls. The irony of her position, a healer presiding over systematic torture, would eventually drive her to suicide, but not before she participated in horrors that defied description. The patients brought to the research hall were told they were receiving cutting-edge treatment, that their suffering would contribute to humanity's greater understanding. What actually happened to them belongs in the darkest annals of human cruelty. The Church had discovered that the human brain, when exposed to certain combinations of old blood and cosmic influence, could be made to expand, literally. The skulls of patients would swell to grotesque proportions as their grey matter grew beyond natural limits, stretching until the bone could no longer contain it. The purpose of these experiments was to force human consciousness to perceive dimensions beyond our own, to artificially create the insight that Master Willem had sought through contemplation and study. But the human mind wasn't meant to comprehend such realities. Patients would scream about seeing threads in the air, about feeling the weight of eyes that weren't there, about hearing the cosmos singing in frequencies that drove them to madness. Some patients lost their sight entirely, their optical nerves burning out from trying to process visual information that existed outside normal space-time. Others developed additional eyes, not metaphorically, but literally, eyes opening in their skulls, their palms, their torsos, each one seeing something different, each vision driving them further from sanity. The research hall's halls echoed with their pleas, their confused mumbling, their moments of terrible clarity when they understood what had been done to them. The living failures, those patients who survived the initial experiments but didn't achieve the transformation the Church sought, were kept in the research hall's lower levels. They wandered in perpetual confusion, their swollen heads making movement difficult, their scattered thoughts preventing any coherent action. Some still called out for Lady Maria, not understanding that she had abandoned them, that their suffering had driven her to take her own life, rather than face what she had done. The school of Mensis, not to be outdone, pursued their own path of experimentation. Their focus was on creating direct contact with the Great Ones, those cosmic entities that existed beyond human perception. They believed that by using human consciousness as a conduit, they could establish communication with these beings and learn the secrets of existence itself. The Mensis ritual, their greatest and most terrible experiment, required materials that couldn't be obtained through voluntary means. They began kidnapping citizens of Yharnam, particularly those from the lower districts who wouldn't be immediately missed. These people were brought to Yahargul, the unseen village, where they were subjected to procedures designed to prepare them for their role in the ritual. The One Reborn, that amalgamation of human bodies fused into a singular, horrific entity, represents the kind of abomination the school of Mensis was willing to create in pursuit of their goals. Dozens, perhaps hundreds of human beings were merged together, their consciousness dissolved into a collective scream of agony, their bodies becoming a single mass of flesh and bone and perpetual suffering. It was meant to be a vessel, something that could contain the power of a great one, but it was only a monument to the depths of human cruelty justified by the pursuit of knowledge. The choir, meanwhile, had made contact with something in the cosmos, Ebrietas, daughter of the cosmos, a great one, abandoned or left behind, in the dungeons beneath the upper cathedral ward. Rather than flee from this entity, the choir embraced it, literally communing with a being whose very existence violated the laws of nature. They would stand before Ebrietas, allowing her influence to wash over them, believing that proximity to such a being would elevate their understanding. The orphans under the choir's care were brought before Ebrietas as well. These children, their minds already shaped by years of indoctrination, were exposed to cosmic truths that no human consciousness should encounter. Some became members of the choir, their perception forever altered. Others simply broke, their minds shattering like glass under the weight of incomprehensible reality. The experiments weren't limited to humans. The church began experimenting with the blood itself, creating new varieties with different properties. They mixed it with quicksilver, creating blood that moved with unnatural purpose. They refined it through multiple hosts, each transmission altering its properties. They even attempted to recreate the original old blood, to synthesize what they had found in the tombs, leading to the creation of substances that should never have existed. The celestial emissary, that grotesque being with its bulbous head and otherworldly presence, was considered one of the choir's greatest successes. It had once been human, multiple humans actually, their consciousness merged and elevated through extensive experimentation. The church saw it as proof that humanity could transcend its limitations, never acknowledging that what they had created was no longer human in any meaningful sense. Meanwhile, the hunters who served the church were beginning to see the true nature of what they protected. Ludwig, despite his faith, couldn't ignore that many of the beasts they fought wore the tattered remnants of church garb. German, the first hunter, withdrew increasingly into the hunter's dream, a pocket dimension that offered escape from the horrors of reality. Other hunters simply went mad, their minds unable to reconcile their duty with their conscience. The blood ministration continued throughout all of this, the public face of the church maintained, even as its private activities descended into nightmare. Citizens of Yharnam still lined up for their treatments, still believed in the church's benevolence, even as their neighbors disappeared in the night, even as the streets filled with more beasts, even as the very air seemed to thicken with wrongness. The church's response to growing criticism was to double down on their practices. They created blood that was more potent, more transformative. They pushed their experiments to greater extremes, believing that they were so close to breakthrough that any sacrifice was justified. They had traveled so far from healing that the very concept had been inverted. Now they sought to transform humanity into something else entirely, whether humanity wanted it or not. The revelation that Laurence himself had succumbed to the beast Scourge, transforming into what many believe became the first cleric beast, should have been the moment of clarity. The founder of the Healing Church, the man who had promised humanity salvation through blood, had become the very thing his institution claimed to protect against. But by then, the church was too deep in its corruption to turn back. They hid Laurence's transformation, continuing his work even as his bestial form howled in the cathedral ward. The burning of old Yharnam marked the point where the church abandoned any pretense of serving humanity. When the beast Scourge erupted in that district, a direct result of the experimental blood used to cure the ashen blood epidemic, the church's solution was complete annihilation. They deployed their hunters not to save the citizens, but to contain them. They set the entire district ablaze, burning the sick alongside the healthy, the human alongside the beast. The powder kegs, the workshop of hunters who favored explosives and fire, carried out the burning with mechanical efficiency. They blocked the exits, ensuring none could escape. They ignored the screams of those who hadn't yet transformed, focusing only on containing the outbreak. When the flames finally died, old Yharnam was a charred ruin, and the church declared it forbidden ground, a cautionary tale about the dangers of the beast Scourge rather than admitting their role in creating it. But even genocide couldn't stop what the church had set in motion. The beast Scourge continued to spread, no longer confined to those who had received experimental blood. The regular ministrations, the foundation of the church's power, were creating beasts at an accelerating rate. The transformation that had once taken years now occurred in months, sometimes weeks. The blood had become poison, but the church couldn't stop administering it without admitting their failure. The final phase of corruption came when the school of Mensis succeeded in their ultimate goal, making contact with a great one called Mergo. Using an artifact known as the third umbilical cord, they performed a ritual that sent their consciousness into the nightmare realm, a dimension where the Great Ones dwelled. The physical bodies of the Mensis scholars remained in Yharnam, sitting in their chairs with cages on their heads, but their minds had travelled somewhere else, somewhere terrible. The success of the Mensis ritual had an immediate and catastrophic effect on Yharnam. The blood moon rose, bathing the city in crimson light that seemed to accelerate the beast transformations. Citizens who had received even small amounts of blood began to change. The barriers between dimensions weakened, allowing things that should not exist to bleed into reality. The amygdalae, those spider-like great ones, became visible to those with enough insight, clinging to buildings throughout the city. The ritual also triggered something in the blood itself. Every dose ever administered, every treatment ever given, suddenly activated like a timer reaching zero. People transformed in their homes, in the streets, in the very churches where they had gone to pray. The hunters, overwhelmed by the sheer number of beasts, could do nothing but try to survive. The church's clergy, those who had genuinely believed in their mission, watched in horror as their life's work revealed itself as damnation. The upper cathedral ward, seat of the choir's power, became a battlefield as the cosmic forces they had been playing with broke free from whatever tenuous control had contained them. The orphans they had experimented on transformed into celestial emissaries, no longer pretending to be human. Ebrietas, the great one they had communed with, stirred from her ancient slumber, her alien consciousness touching the minds of everyone in the vicinity. Throughout all of this, the Healing Church maintained its official position that they were humanity's salvation, that the blood was sacred, that everything they did was for the greater good. Even as Yharnam burned, even as beasts roamed freely through previously safe streets, even as the cosmos itself seemed to press down upon the city, the church bells continued to ring, calling the faithful to prayer. Some members of the church, facing the complete collapse of everything they had built, chose to embrace the transformation. They injected themselves with massive doses of blood, seeking to become beasts powerful enough to survive what was coming. Others retreated deeper into their research, convinced that the answer lay in pushing even further, that they had simply not gone far enough in their experiments. The school of Mensis, their consciousness trapped in the nightmare, achieved a kind of immortality. But at what cost? Their physical bodies rotted in their chairs, while their minds experienced eternal torment in a realm where human logic held no meaning. They had succeeded in their goal of making contact, but the contact had destroyed them more thoroughly than death ever could. The legacy of the Healing Church's corruption extends beyond the physical destruction of Yharnam. They had fundamentally altered what it meant to be human in their world. The blood spread throughout the population over generations, had created a species on the verge of transformation. Every person who had received ministration carried within them the potential for beasthood, a ticking bomb that could activate at any moment. The church had also broken the barriers between dimensions, allowing the influence of the Great Ones to seep into reality. The city existed in multiple states simultaneously: the physical Yharnam, the nightmare realms, the hunter's dream, all overlapping and bleeding into each other. Reality itself had been corrupted by the church's ambition. Perhaps most tragically, the church had corrupted the very concept of healing. What had begun as genuine medical treatment had been perverted into something that caused more suffering than it cured. Trust in medicine, in science, in institutions meant to protect and serve, all had been shattered. The citizens of Yharnam who survived had learned that salvation could be worse than damnation, that those who promised to heal could be the source of the greatest sickness. The hunters, those brave souls who tried to stem the tide of beasts, found themselves fighting an impossible battle. For every beast they killed, the church's blood created 2 more. Some hunters, like Jura in old Yharnam, came to understand that the beasts had once been people, that killing them was killing victims rather than monsters. This realization broke many hunters, driving them to madness or despair. The transformation of the church from healer to destroyer wasn't sudden. It was a gradual slide, each compromise making the next easier, each experiment pushing the boundaries a little further. Laurence probably believed until the end that he was serving humanity, even as he transformed into a beast. The choir likely thought they were elevating human consciousness, even as they turned children into cosmic aberrations. The school of Mensis certainly believed they were unlocking the secrets of existence, even as they invited damnation into the world. This gradual corruption makes the Healing Church's story all the more horrifying. They weren't cartoon villains twirling their mustaches and planning evil. They were people who believed they were doing good, who justified each horrible act as necessary for the greater benefit. The road to damnation was paved with good intentions, medical breakthroughs, and the desperate hope of transcendence. In the end, the Healing Church achieved a kind of transcendence, just not the kind they had sought. They transcended morality, humanity, and even sanity itself. They became something beyond human, but in becoming so, they lost everything that had made them human in the first place. Their legacy is a city of beasts and madmen, where the blood moon rises eternal and the bells toll for souls that can no longer be saved. The 3 phases of corruption, from the schism that birthed the church, through its rise to absolute power, to the experiments that damned it, show us how even the noblest intentions can be perverted when power goes unchecked and ambition exceeds wisdom. Master Willem had been right to fear the old blood, to warn against its use. But his warning came too late, and his greatest student became the architect of humanity's downfall. Standing now in the ruins of Yharnam, walking streets where beasts prowl and cosmic horrors lurk just beyond perception, we can trace every horror back to that moment when Laurence chose the blood over wisdom. The Healing Church's corruption wasn't inevitable. It was a series of choices, each one seeming reasonable at the time, each one taking them further from their original purpose. The church's bells still ring in Yharnam, though few remain to hear them. They echo through empty streets and abandoned homes, a reminder of promises broken and trust betrayed. The grand cathedrals stand as monuments not to human achievement, but to human hubris. The blood still flows, though now it brings only transformation and madness. What makes the Healing Church's story so compelling and terrifying is its plausibility. Given the same power, the same desperate hope, the same cosmic temptation, Would humanity make different choices? Or would we, like Laurence and his followers, convince ourselves that the ends justify the means, that suffering today ensures salvation tomorrow, that we have the wisdom to wield power that was never meant for human hands? The answer lies in the streets of Yharnam, where the beast Scourge reigns eternal and the Healing Church's corruption has become complete. From salvation to damnation, from healing to horror, from humanity to something else entirely. This is the legacy of those who believed they could improve upon nature, who thought they could steal fire from the gods without getting burned. Thank you for joining me on this exploration into one of gaming's darkest narratives. The Healing Church's story serves as a warning wrapped in horror, a cautionary tale about the dangers of unchecked ambition and the corruption that comes from believing ourselves above the natural order. If this deep dive into Bloodborne's lore has resonated with you, please consider subscribing to the channel. Your support helps me continue creating these detailed explorations into gaming's most intricate stories. Hit that notification bell to ensure you don't miss future investigations into the shadows that lurk in our favourite games. Remember, in the worlds we explore here at Keen 7 Lore, knowledge itself can be a kind of corruption, and the truths we uncover are often more terrifying than the mysteries they replace. But we seek them anyway, drawn like moths to flame, because understanding the darkness is the first step to appreciating the light. Until next time, fellow seekers, may your insight grow and your humanity remain intact. This has been Keen 7 Lore, where no secret stays buried and no lore goes unexplored. Fear the old blood, and farewell.